As the Venetian Crusade was coming to a close in 1123, the unified Crusader states, under the rule of King Baldwin II, found themselves in a crucial moment. Ever since the Battle of Aazaz, the Latins had been on the defense against various Seljuk Atabegs in Syria, such as the Burids in Damascus or the Artakids from Aleppo and Mardin. However, as King Baldwin's rule over the Latin Levant reached its tipping point, the Seljuk warlords to the east raised the stakes, becoming willing to sacrifice thousands of lives in order to fulfill their ambitions of westward expansion at the expense of the Frankish elite. Can Baldwin finally restore balance in the north? Will the Latins be finally able to discard their defensive policy in favour of greater expansion in the name of Christ? In our latest video on the Second Crusade, we will cover the Battle of Azaz, the bloodiest battle in the age of the Crusades. We invite you to stick around until the end to see who comes out on top. As is no doubt clear by this point in the series, many leaders in the medieval world made many mistakes. But we say don't criticize too harshly until you've put yourself in their shoes with the sponsor of this video, Bellwright. This is an open-world medieval strategy and survival sim game, in which you play as a framed outlaw returning to the land from which you were banished to begin building a rebellion. And building is the key word, as you'll be crafting custom-made settlements to house your allies, amid the beautiful landscapes of Unreal Engine 5. You'll need to rally your people to battle, and take part in the action yourself as you deal with threats, expand to claim new resources, and ultimately challenge the Queen of the Land in your quest to ring the bells of both vengeance and freedom. By leveling up your character, utilizing your companions, and applying clever strategy, your rise to power will be unstoppable. The game is out now in early access, is playable solo or co-op with a friend, and new updates are regularly added, such as the recent forestry update. You can check the game out on Steam and learn about all the features in more detail by clicking our link in the description. When Venetian Crusaders assisted the Latins during the siege of Tyre in 1123, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and Count Edessa Josselin were both ambushed in two separate incidents by Il-Ghazi's son and Atabeg of Aleppo, Balak Ghazi. In both cases, each Frankish noble was taken as a prisoner and held in the Armenian stronghold of Carput. The capture of such highly situated Latin leaders put the fate of the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem into potential jeopardy. Fortunately, King Baldwin's previous reforms allowed for the temporary stability of the realm. However, the news of the Crusaders' successes in Tyre hadn't reached the monarch in Carput, who was becoming increasingly worried about his absence in Jerusalem. While Baldwin was uncertain of the Outremer's future, Josselin used his good reputation among the local Armenian population. Ever sympathetic to Josselin's tolerant policy towards Armenians in his county, they were convinced by him to sneak into the castle as pilgrims, murder the Turkic garrison, and free both leaders. However, despite being liberated, Baldwin and Josselin realized that even if they all managed to escape the fortress, they would be quickly detained by Balak's swift Turkoman riders. Even more worryingly, word of their prison break had already reached the Atabeg, who sent an entire army to retake Carput. At this point, Baldwin II convinced Josselin to escape first in order to find help, while he and the Armenians would buy Josselin some time to escape and defend the castle. To make sure Josselin would be recognized, Baldwin gave him his own ring and 3 Armenian servants to make sure he would safely reach the Frankish territory. Moving only by night to prevent detection, the Count of Edessa managed to reach the Euphrates. Exhausted and weakened by the captivity, Josselin could not swim, but using their wineskins as floats, they all managed to cross the water and reach the opposite shore. After reaching his county, Josselin revealed himself to his wife and court at Tebussul. After a brief reunion, he immediately rushed to Antioch to seek assistance, but because of the losses at the Battle of Aazaz and Hab, Patriarch Bernard, who governed the Antiochian Principality in Labor's absence, could not provide the knights Josselin had been so hoping for. After several failed attempts to raise the army in Antioch, Josselin rode in haste to Jerusalem. Upon arrival, he devoted his chains at the altar of Calvary, thanking God for his fortunate escape. Next, he informed Patriarch Gormor and Constable Eustace, who had governed the kingdom during the king's absence, about Baldwin's situation in Armenia, asking for troops for a rescue mission, to which they agreed. With his rescue party in hand, Josselin rode north in haste to Baldwin's relief. but by the time he reached the Euphrates, it was already too late. Baldwin's resistance at Kirpurt had fallen apart faster than expected. In Josselin's absence, Balak's engineers had dug a tunnel and managed to undermine a section of the wall that allowed the Artikid warriors to enter the castle. All Armenians who had assisted in the coup were killed by Balak, while Baldwin II himself was transferred to a more guarded fortress at Harran. The Latin army of Josselin could not reach Le Bourg that far without risking a possible ambush or a major battle. Still undeterred, the Count of Edessa raided the Aleppo countryside, demanding the King of Jerusalem's release. However, after seeing the futility of his actions, he decided to return to Tobruk. Although Josselin's attempt to rescue the king failed, Balak could not exploit his victory, mainly because of the revolt of Menbiji's governor. Realizing he could not afford to lose that city, he sent his loyal general Timotash to defeat the rebels' army at the city walls. Timotash quickly mobilized his men and forced the enemy outside of Menbij, scoring a decisive victory. But Menbiji's citadel was still in the hands of the rebels, led by the governor's brother Issa. Desperate, the rebels asked the Count of Edessa for aid. Josselin moved with his army to capture the city, but was intercepted by Balak's army and was soundly defeated under the city walls. Balak then proceeded to continue the siege, but was hit by an arrow from citadel defenders and died shortly afterwards. With the death of Balak Ghazi, the Artikid state was yet again embroiled in internal fighting. During this power struggle, Ilghazi's son Timotash came to power as the next Atabeg. Upon realizing that he could benefit immensely from Baldwin's release, he entered into negotiations with the Franks. The king and the Latin realm were represented by Josselin and Baldwin's wife, King Morphia of Melitene. The Munkadites of Shaizar, who were attempting to better their relations with the Latins, served as mediators, going so far as to send some of their own people as hostages to Timotash. After intense talks, the Atabeg of Aleppo agreed to Baldwin's return in exchange for the strategic castles of Athareb, Kafatab, Zadana and Azaz, an exorbitant sum of 80,000 dinars, the exchange of valuable hostages to guarantee the terms would be honoured, and a promise that both Latin leaders would jointly attack the local Bedouin chieftain, the Bais ibn Sadaka. These demands were exceptionally harsh for the Crusader states in Syria, as it meant handing every major border stronghold they had captured back into Muslim hands. Reluctantly, the Latin delegation agreed, and after 16 months of captivity, Baldwin II was finally released in August 1124. When Le Bourg left Harran, he realized just how unfavorable the bargain had been for the Franks. If all the eastern border fortifications were to be taken back into Aleppo's sphere of influence, this could make Timotash the greatest threat to Latin security in northern Syria since Ilghazi. Knowing too well that the Lord of Mardin and Aleppo wouldn't execute young Josselin and Joveta, he decided not to honour his obligations. All King Baldwin needed was a pretext, which he easily found. Prince of Antioch Bohemond II had turned 16 years old and could thus inherit the principality. However, he was still in Italy. This meant that Baldwin Le Bourg could still act in the boy's name as Antioch's regent. Since Baldwin couldn't bargain for Antiochene territory in the absence of Bohemond II, the legal ruler of Antioch, he officially asked Antioch's patriarch Bernard for permission. Naturally, the patriarch refused to hand the eastern parts of the principality to the Muslims, so Baldwin II gladly used this factor as a pretext to break his oath, assembling forces from Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch and Edessa, and preparing for an upcoming showdown. Doing the opposite of what he had been expected to do per the terms of his release, Baldwin allied himself with the Bedouin leader Debais, thus adding Bedouin tribes to the Frankish host. Together they planned to take the initiative and siege Aleppo before Timotash could respond from his main power base at Mardin. The situation inside the city looked very promising for the Latins, as the city's great leader Ridwan was dead, the Artikid clan split, and Aleppo was consumed by a power struggle between factions. Internal divisions between Ilghazi's successors were used by Ridwan's son, Sultan Shah ibn Redwan, who rose in rebellion against Timotash and rode into the Bedouin Crusaders' camp, hoping to be installed as the rightful ruler of Aleppo. The idea of installing a pro-Frankish ruler was too tempting a prospect for the Christians to refuse. However, they first had to ensure Caesar's neutrality in the south and ease minor tensions between the Munkadites and the Principality. After these matters were settled, the Latins marched straight to Aleppo with their Bedouin and other Muslim allies. Baldwin attacked from Atta, while Josselin marched from Tel Bashir with Dubais. The attack from both sides took Aleppo's forces by surprise, forcing them to hide behind the city walls. On the 19th of October 1124, Baldwin, Josselin and Dubais' groups all rejoined under the walls of Aleppo and encircled the city. Meanwhile, the situation inside the city was getting dire for its citizens. The city itself was not prepared for a siege, morale was at an all-time low, and even worse for the defenders, some of Ibn Radwan's supporters in the city were eager to open the gates for their sultan. Even more worryingly for Aleppo, Timurtash decided to stay in Mardin and neglect the Franco-Bedouin siege in favour of securing his inheritance from his brother, Suleiman of Myafarakin. The abandonment of Aleppo would cost the Artukid Atabeg dearly. In desperation, the citizens of Aleppo wrote a letter to Timurtash pleading for help. Not only was the Lord of Mardin unwilling to send aid, but he was angered by Aleppo's willingness to capitulate and ordered the city's emissaries to be arrested. However, the Aleppo ambassadors managed to escape from prison and, in desperate need of allies, went to Mosul, begging its Atabeg for immediate rescue in return for pledging their allegiance to the Seljuk warlord. Mosul's Atabeg, Aksunkur al-Basuki, was eager to take his revenge on the Latins for his defeat at Samin in 1115, and was buoyed by the opportunity to undermine the Artukids by seizing Aleppo for himself. Thus he marched westward to relieve the city. With a huge army at his disposal, and with the blessing of the Sultan of the Great Seljuks, Mahmudi Muhammadi Malikzar, he easily convinced other Muslim powers to his cause, receiving additional forces from Emir of Homs, Kirkan, and Toktekin of Damascus. The Latin sources of William of Tyre and Fulcher of Shat state that Aksunkur's force numbered 15,000 strong, while the Armenian Matthew of Edessa indicates that the Atabeg of Mosul came to command over 40,000 men. Though Matthew of Edessa's numbers are probably overestimated, a 15,000-man army was still formidable by the Outremer's standards. This Seljuk host managed to reach Aleppo at the end of January 1124. Meanwhile, the besieging Latin and Bedouin army had begun to fall apart. At first, the Bedouin chieftain Dubais had intended to block Basuki's force on the Euphrates, while Baldwin II continued the siege, believing that the city's capture was imminent. However, in a matter of only a few days, it became apparently clear that Labor had been incorrect, and the city's fall was not imminent. Despite Ibn Radwan's supporters inside the city, most of its defenders didn't give in, and the siege dragged on for long enough for Aksunkur's army to arrive. Upon learning about the relieving force, the Franks and the Bedouins knew that Basuki possessed numerical superiority. Baldwin didn't want to risk an open battle under Aleppo's walls. Instead, the Bedouin groups retreated east, while Baldwin moved his Latin force back to the Athareb, after which he went to Jerusalem to celebrate his return from 2 years of absence. Satisfied with his maneuver, al-Basuki decided to stop the pursuit and return to Aleppo to celebrate his victory, for the time being. The siege of Aleppo had been lifted. Freed from its troubles, the city's government submitted itself to Basuki, surrendering to him its formidable citadel, treasury, and all Latin hostages previously owned by Timurtash. With his power base in northern Syria and Mesopotamia secured at Artukid expense, Basuki again turned his attention to Antioch's territory, where he intended to continue Timurtash's policy of demanding the handover of its border strongholds. Leading his troops from Mosul and Aleppo, the Atabeg started his campaign by striking the Principality of Antioch at its southeastern frontier, capturing the fortresses of Al-Bara and Kavatab after a short siege. After securing both of these castles, the Lord of Mosul and Aleppo marched north with his ally Toktekin to attack the Antiochian fortress of Zardana. Despite being attacked by this enormous army, Zardana was able to withstand the siege, and its defenders even managed to send word to Baldwin. When the news reached Antioch and later Jerusalem, King Baldwin yet again rallied all Crusader states under his banner, including the Tripolitan contingent of Pons and Josselin's Latins of Edessa. In addition, the Crusader forces were joined by an Armenian contingent led by Duke Levin from Cilicia. In total, the Franco-Armenian forces, claimed by Latin historians, numbered around 1,100 knights and 2,000 infantrymen. However, it is very likely that these historians mentioned only Frankish warriors, neglecting their Armenian counterparts. Meanwhile, an Armenian author estimated the size of Baldwin's army to be 1,300 knights and 4,000 infantry overall, which is probably the largest possible capacity of the Christian forces. As the Latin and Armenian forces were gathered near Antioch, King Baldwin received news that al-Basuki redirected his focus from Zardana to Azaz. Not willing to let his mighty fortress slip into Aleppo's hands, he left Antioch with his joint forces and reached Cyrrhus, where he ordered his troops to leave their baggage train behind to speed up their march. Meanwhile, the besieged garrison of Azaz knew it could not hold for long, mainly due to the constant bombardment of 12 ballistae brought by Basuki from Aleppo. But on the 11th of June 1125, as the Muslims were just about to break through Azaz's defences, Baldwin's army finally arrived, approaching from Basuki's rear. Jerusalem had arrived, and the bloodiest battle of the Outremer was about to begin. Sources differ on the exact outcome of the battle. However, what we do know is that the sudden approach of the Latin army must have heavily impacted al-Basuki's decisions, as Baldwin II managed to corner the Muslims between Azaz's walls and the Christian army. According to Fulcher of Chartres, Baldwin deployed his army in two lines. The left side of the front line was filled with knights and soldiers from Edessa commanded by Count Josselin, while the right flank was led by Tripolitan troops commanded by Lord Pont of Tripoli. The second line was commanded by King Baldwin le Bour and his forces from Jerusalem, most likely accompanied by Armenian auxiliaries. Baldwin's army pitched a camp outside of the city and even managed to establish a line of communication with the Edessan defenders. From this point on, the Latin sources of William of Tyre and Fulcher claim that the battle took place only in the fortress's vicinity. But Armenian chronicler Matthew of Edessa shares a different, more detailed, and perhaps less glamorous version of this engagement. Matthew states that after the Latins and Armenians set up their camp, Basuki and Togtekin's army turned from Azaz and sent their archers and horse archers to barrage the freshly arrived opponents. For 3 days straight, the Franks and Armenians in the camp were hammered by the Turkomans' arrows, constantly hearing shouts and war cries from opposing sides. Even worse, foraging parties riding outside the camp were forced to return empty-handed due to possible casualties. Things were not looking good for Baldwin, who had left all his army's food behind with the baggage train in Cyrrhus. Soon the Crusaders were faced with the prospect of starvation. Thinking the Franks were already demoralized by hunger, Basuki withdrew his archers and ordered them to charge down the camp head-on. A quickly deployed Frankish formation was immediately crushed by the impending Muslim force. After initial fighting, it was clear that the numerically superior Muslim force would eventually overwhelm the Crusaders. However, just as things were looking the most dire for the Christians, King Baldwin developed a plan. He knew that the enemy had more than twice the numbers the Franks and Armenians had. So the Monarch of Jerusalem decided to cast the proverbial die and announced an orderly retreat in the direction of Atharib. However, this was no true withdrawal. In fact, Baldwin was using the Seljuk tactic of false retreat to lure Basuki out of Azaz so that the Muslim army would lose its cohesion. Unsurprisingly, the Atabeg of Mosul took the bait and, thinking that the Franks had escaped the battlefield, followed in pursuit of his Christian enemies. While moving southwest to Atharib, Baldwin received a firing beacon from Josselin's men in Azaz, reporting the King of al-Basuki's decision to follow them. During the chase, the Muslim forces divided into their own groups, just as the King of Jerusalem had hoped they would. When his army was 2 miles south of Azaz, Baldwin ordered his men to halt, take a quick rest, and turn around towards their pursuers. Matthew of Edessa mentioned that the Latins were desperate for food and water, so in order to acquire any possible provisions, they were willing to fight to the death. As the disorganized and separate detachments from Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus and Homs met the Latins, they found themselves exhausted. Moreover, they were almost entirely out of arrows, which meant that they would have no choice but to face the Latin knights and footmen in melee combat. It was at this moment when King Baldwin, emboldened by his foe's fatigue, ordered the battle trumpets to blare, signifying a charge on Basuki's men. The Edessan and Tripolitan troops stormed forward from the left, the men of Jerusalem from the center, and the men of Antioch from the right. All of them descended with fury on disorganized Turkic warriors. According to Muslim chronicler al-Basuki, the Muslim warriors at first attempted to keep their distance and fired upon the charging Latins with whatever arrows they had, but realizing the distance between them and the Franks was too short, the Mosul and Damascene troops decided to form an improvised line to prepare for the enemy's charge. In a matter of minutes, the Latins and Armenians ploughed through the Muslim line. A desperate melee soon ensued, and with heavier armor and better skill in hand-to-hand combat, the Crusaders developed a clear upper hand over their eastern counterparts. Soon, the Latins and Armenians from Cilicia started to gain ground. It was Count Joscelin, reportedly fighting like a ferocious roaring lion, that first managed to break through the enemy line, spreading terror amongst the Mosul and Damascene armies. In a short period of time, the Muslim warriors dispersed all over the plain. Victorious Baldwin and the rest of the Latin knights followed his Edessan count, and many of their opponents were hunted down all the way to Azaz. Some of the Latin contingents chased the Muslim warriors all the way to the outskirts of Aleppo. All in all, although sources differ, the Muslim army likely lost anywhere between 2,000 and 7,000 warriors, making the Battle of Azaz one of the greatest bloodbaths in the history of the Crusades and one of the worst military disasters in Seljuk history. The battle was a total victory for the Latins and Armenians, and a testament to Baldwin Lobor's strategic genius, which shone through even in the most hopeless situation. More importantly, Baldwin II seized al-Basuki's and Toktekin's camps, complete with all the goods left behind by the Seljuk warlords. Its value was estimated by Latin sources to be around 80,000 byzants, thus providing the Latins with a better bargaining position in the conflict. Meanwhile, Basuki returned beaten and humiliated all the way back to Mosul, remaining in Aleppo with only his son Masud as its governor. As the dust settled, the Christian force retreated back to Antioch in glory, while Prince Levin returned back to Armenia. Both parties planned to renew the fighting. However, in doing so, both rulers encountered severe obstacles. Al-Basuki's authority was in shambles, and reconstructing his devastated army seemed almost impossible. Meanwhile, in the Principality of Antioch, the rightful heir, Bohemond II, had arrived from Italy in 1126 to claim Antioch from his father, Bohemond I. This forced Baldwin to resign from Antioch's regency and from absolute control over its manpower and resources. Moreover, due to Bohemond's temper, King Baldwin's attention would have to shift in another direction. All these factors forced both leaders to settle around peace talks, during which a line was drawn between the interests of Antioch and Aleppo. All of the bordering strongholds of Atharib, Al-Bara, Zardana and Azaz remained in Latin hands except for Kafatab, which was handed to Aleppo. Through the looted goods gathered from Muslim camps in the battle's aftermath, Baldwin II was able to pay the ransom for his daughter Javette and Joscelin's son. This ransom went fully into al-Basuki's pocket and not Timotash's, which the Archkid of Mardin took as a great offense, but ultimately there was nothing he could do. Fate was also unkind to Aksunkur, as he was publicly murdered by a group of Nizari assassins in the Great Mosque of Mosul, leaving all his power in the hands of his young son Masud. Baldwin, on the other hand, had returned to Jerusalem as a victor, and was heralded by huge celebrations upon his return. Along the way, the king built a fortress near Beirut on Mount Glavianus to better guard the Tripolitan route from Antioch to Jerusalem. After splendid celebrations in the Holy City, King Baldwin II Lebor planned his next moves with one particular foe in mind, the Emirate of Damascus. Overall, the Battle of Azaz significantly reshaped the balance of power in Syria. The Latins were able to regain their power and prestige, restoring Antioch and Edessa to their previous conditions before the Battle of Ager-Sanguinis in 1119. This battle had finally allowed Baldwin and his realm to change its policy from defensive to offensive expansion on all its fronts. On the Muslim side, it would also mark a turning point, as from the chaos of constant warfare in Syria, new figures would rise to reshape the Outremer forever. In our next video on the Second Crusade, we will focus on the Crusader offensive of 1129, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.